She lifted her chin and said he'd sent for a whole woman, not half of one. The letter came on a Thursday. I know because Thursdays were the days Doris Pell sorted the mail at the Mercantile, and Doris had a habit of holding anything that looked personal an extra beat longer than she needed to, reading the return address twice. She handed me the envelope with 2 fingers, like it might be warm. I didn't open it in town. I rode the 4 miles back to the ranch with it in my breast pocket, and I could feel it the whole way, not the paper, just the knowing it was there. The mare knew something was off. She kept flicking her left ear back at me. I'd written to the agency in March. It was January now, nearly February. 10 months of nothing, and I'd talked myself out of hoping somewhere around the 6th month. So when I finally sat down at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me and the lamp turned up, my hands were steady. I wasn't nervous. I'd given up being nervous about it. Her name was Cecilia Voss. She was 34 years old, widowed 3 years prior from a town in Missouri I'd never heard of. She could cook, keep house, ride passably, had no children living. She said she was not a woman of great beauty, but she was not plain either, and she wrote that line without apology, which told me something. She said she'd read my letter twice. She said she understood what I was and was not asking for, and that if I was a serious man writing to a serious agency, she would come in April. That was all, 1 page front only. I read it 4 times that night. I don't know what I was looking for after the second read. Something I'd missed, maybe. Some word that would make her real to me. But she stayed a name and a date, and I folded the letter back the way it came and put it in the tin box under the floorboard where I kept the deed to the land and my discharge papers and the photograph of my mother. Then I went to bed and lay there staring at the ceiling for 2 hours. I ought to say something about what I looked like at that point in my life, because it matters. Not vanity, just the truth of it, because she would have to look at me every day. I was 51. I'd been a deputy marshal for 11 years in 2 different territories before my hip got broken in a way it didn't come back from right, and I'd bought the ranch outside Garfield with what I'd saved and what my uncle left me, and I'd been running cattle for going on 8 years since. I was not a ruined man. The ranch was in good shape. The cattle were healthy. I kept the house tighter than most bachelors manage, which I'm not modest about. My mother raised me that way, and I'd maintained it out of habit and because disorder grated on me. But the hip made me walk with a hitch, worse in the cold. And somewhere around year 4 of this life, I'd gotten into a disagreement with a man who went for my face with a broken bottle, and though the cut healed, it left a seam from the corner of my left eye down to my jaw that was visible from 6 feet away in good light. My hair had gone white before I was 40. I was lean to the point of looking spare, and I'd been told more than once, eyes that made people uneasy when I looked at them too long without blinking. I was not a soft man. I knew it. The years I'd spent keeping the peace in bad country had done what they do. I wasn't unkind, but I didn't put people at ease the way some men do. The hands who worked for me were loyal, but they didn't linger after work was done. I ate most suppers alone. So when I wrote to that agency, I was clear. I laid it out plain. The age, the scar, the hip, the work, that it was hard country and a hard life, that I wasn't looking for a young woman and I wasn't promising anything easy. I said if a woman wanted warmth and a man who was soft around the edges, I wasn't her answer. I said I could offer a decent house, sound land, a fair man, and my full faithfulness. That was the word I used. Faithfulness. It was the word I meant. And Cecilia Voss wrote back 1 page, said she understood what I was and was not asking for, and that she'd come in April. She came in April. Late April the 23rd, the stage from Cutter's Fork arriving at 2:30 in the afternoon. I'd driven the wagon in. I told myself I was being practical. Easier to get her trunks on a wagon bed than tied to a saddle. But the truth is I didn't trust my hip on horseback for a 4-mile ride with a stranger beside me and nothing to hold onto. The wagon at least gave me something to do with my hands. I waited at the stage office. There were 3 other passengers on that coach when it pulled in. A traveling salesman I recognized from the year before, a young rancher from the north end of the valley, and a woman. I knew it was her before she stepped all the way down, and I don't know how exactly. Something in the way she stood at the top of the step, taking in the street before she came down it. Like she was doing a survey. Not afraid, just looking. She was medium height, dark hair pulled back hard. She wore a gray traveling dress that was dusty from the road and a hat that had lost its shape a little at the brim. Her face was what I'd said it was, not plain. There were lines around her eyes, not from age so much as from use, the kind that come from squinting into light or from weather or from years of something that had cost her. She had a mouth set in a particular way that I would come to understand was not her resting expression but her arriving expression, the one she wore when she was sorting out what she was walking into. She saw me and she came straight across the dirt without hesitating. Most people, when they first look at my face, flinch or hold too still. She did neither. She looked at me the way you look at a map, studying, not judging. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Not a question. "Miss Voss." We shook hands. Hers was dry and had a grip to it. "The trunks are 2, she said. "The brown one and the black one's heavier." "All right." That was the whole of it. I got the trunks and we loaded them, and I handed her up to the wagon seat, and we drove out of Garfield without further ceremony. The first 2 miles she didn't say much. I didn't push it. I'd learned years ago that silence has its own texture. Some silence is comfortable, some is loaded, some is a person deciding something. Hers felt like the third kind, and I left it alone. About 2 miles out she said, "You didn't mention in your letter that your hair was white." Didn't seem important. It's not a complaint, I was just surprised. I didn't say anything. She said, "How long has the scar been there?" 8 years. "Does it bother you when people look at it?" "Less than it used to." She nodded like that was a satisfactory answer. Then she was quiet again. I watched the road. The April grass on either side was coming in pale green, not full yet, and the mountains were still carrying snow on the upper shoulders. After a while she said, "You were a lawman." 11 years. "And before that?" "Cattle hand. 2 years out of the war, then a deputy, then here." "You wrote that the ranch is 800 acres. 840 closer to." Another silence. Then, "In Missouri my husband had a farm, 200 acres of bottomland. It flooded twice in 4 years. The second time we lost the crops and the equipment both, and he died that winter. Not from the flood, just from—" She stopped. "He was worn out," she said. "There's a kind of tired you can't come back from." I knew what she was talking about. I'd seen it in men in the field, and I'd seen it in men in peacetime too, and I didn't pretend otherwise. "I'm sorry," I said, not because it was the thing to say, because I meant it. She turned and looked at me. It was a long look, a few seconds at least, and I kept my eyes on the road. "Thank you," she said. We didn't get married right away. I hadn't assumed we would. She wanted to see the house and the land first, which was fair, and I wanted her to have that time without pressure, which I'd said in my letter and I meant. She spent the first day going through the house room by room, quiet, not touching things, just looking. I stayed out of her way. I had fence to check on the east quarter, and I used that excuse and checked it slowly and came back at supper time. She'd made supper. Not a spread, just beans and salt pork and cornbread, but the cornbread was made properly, not the gummy kind, and the beans had something in them, a herb or a spice, that made them better than they had any right to be. We ate across from each other at the kitchen table. The lamp was between us. I noticed she ate everything on her plate. "The house is in better condition than I expected," she said. "I keep it." "I can see that." She broke off a piece of the cornbread. "The bedroom, which one were you intending?" I'd given her the larger one. the one with the east window that got the morning light first. I put clean linens on it and moved my things to the smaller room without saying anything about it. "The small one's mine," I said, "unless you'd prefer it otherwise." She set the cornbread down. "You moved yourself to the small room." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That wasn't necessary." "Maybe not, it's done." She looked at me. "We can discuss the arrangements, Mr. Calloway, after some time." "Elias," I said, "if you're willing." A pause. "Cecilia," she said. The days that followed had a plainness to them that I want to be careful to describe right, because it wasn't dull, it was the opposite of dull. It was just real. She woke early, earlier than me, and I'd come down to find the stove already lit and coffee already made, and she'd be at the kitchen table reading or mending, and she'd say good morning without looking up, and I'd pour coffee and go out to start the morning's work. She learned the place fast, not just the house, the land. Inside a week she'd ridden out to the east quarter and the creek pasture and the far well on the south fence, on the old bay gelding I kept for general use, and she came back with observations. "The south fence was in worse shape than I thought," she said. "The creek was running lower than she'd expected for April. The east quarter had more grass than the rest. Had I considered moving the breeding cows there for the summer?" I had not, as a matter of fact. And the south fence was worse than I thought. She was right on both counts. "Where'd you learn to read land?" I asked. "My father had cattle," she said. "Before the farm, I grew up watching it." I found I was putting her observations away the same place I'd put the observations of my best deputy, years back, a man named Harker who was small and quiet and saw things no one else saw. You stored those things careful, and you trusted them. The second week she encountered Prout. Dale Prout was a man who ran about 400 acres north of my property line, who I had several years of uneasy history with over water rights, and a boundary line we'd never fully agreed on. He wasn't a violent man, but he was the kind of man who tests, who presses to find where a thing gives. He came by on a Wednesday afternoon when I was in the barn, and she was in the kitchen garden I'd left largely untended, and she'd started clearing. I heard him from the barn, heard his horse first, then his voice, calling out hello toward the house. I came out and he was already talking to her, or at her, the way he did, leaning down from the saddle with that particular ease that wasn't actually ease. "Didn't know Cal had company," he was saying. "I'm not company," Cecilia said. She didn't look up from what she was clearing. "I'm the woman who lives here." Prout's smile shifted. "That right, I hadn't heard." "Now you have." She straightened up and looked at him directly, not hostile, just direct. "I'm sure Elias will be out shortly." I was already out. I came up beside the fence and Prout looked at me, and I looked at him, and we went through our usual brief silence, which had its own history to it. "Just being neighborly," he said. "I know what you are," I said. Prout glanced at Cecilia. She'd gone back to working and was paying him no more attention than she'd pay a fence post. He didn't quite know what to do with that. He left. Cecilia kept working. After a minute she said, "Water rights." "Partly. He'll push again. He always does." She pulled a root up with both hands and set it aside. "You'll need to draw the line somewhere he can read." "I know it." She looked at me over her shoulder. "I'm not telling you your business, just saying what I see." "I know it," I said again. "You're not wrong." She went back to the root. There was something in the way she said it, "I'm not telling you your business," that told me she'd had a version of this with her husband too, and that she'd found a way to be a useful woman without taking over a man's authority, which was a harder balance than it sounds, and she'd done it without making it look careful. It just was. We married the second Sunday of May. We drove to Garfield, said the words in front of Judge Paris, and drove back. I bought a ring at the hardware store, not the hardware store proper, but old Kells kept a small case of jewelry that had accumulated over the years from trades and debts paid in kind, and there was a silver band plain that fit her. She looked at it when I put it on her finger. Then she looked at me. "It fits," she said. "I measured your finger while you were sleeping," I said. She raised both eyebrows. "The drawstring from your sewing bag," I said. "I used the length of it. You don't wear any rings on your right hand, so I used the same finger on the right to gauge it." She was quiet for a moment, then she said that was clever. "I didn't want it to not fit," I said. Something happened in her face. I can't describe it exactly. It was a loosening, a very small one, like something she'd been holding for a while just let go a little. She looked down at the ring and turned it once with her thumb. Then she put her hand on my arm just briefly and said, "It's a good ring, Elias." The summer was work. That's the truth of any ranch summer, and I'm not going to pad it out to make it sound otherwise. We branded in June. She helped with the fire and the branding irons. I hadn't asked her to, but she came out at first light and took up a station and didn't ask what was needed, just watched for a minute and figured it out. One of my hands, a young man named Tully, started to explain the process to her, and she said pleasantly, "I've seen branding before, thank you." Tully's ears went red and he went back to work. After that, the hands knew what they were dealing with. She made the kitchen garden into something real by July, tomatoes and beans and squash and potatoes, and a row of herbs I didn't know the names of, but that improved everything she cooked. She canned through August, row after row of jars lined up on the pantry shelves, and watching that pantry fill was a feeling I didn't entirely have words for, because it was the first time in 8 years on that land that it had looked like someone intended to stay. I don't think she knew what it meant to me, or maybe she did. We'd come to a kind of ease with each other by midsummer. I don't mean we'd grown into warmth, I mean we'd come to a working ease, the kind where you trust the other person's judgment and you trust your own, and the two of you move around the same space without collision. She knew which problems were hers to manage and which were mine. She knew when to say something and when to leave it. She didn't mother me, and she didn't defer to me when she thought I was wrong, which I respected more than the deferring, because the deferring would have been a lie. But she was careful too. We were still two people finding the edges of the other. She slept in the East Room. We were polite at the table. We were allies more than anything else, and I didn't push for more. I'd told her I was a serious man writing to a serious agency, and I meant to act like it. It was a Wednesday in September when the thing happened that I need to tell carefully, because it's the thing that changed the proportion of everything else. I'd taken the north section fence line alone that morning. The hip had been worse for a week, change of season, cold coming in off the mountains, and I hadn't said anything about it to Cecilia, which was a kind of pride that cost me. I should have taken Tully. I didn't. My horse came down wrong crossing the dry wash on the north end. She didn't fall, she stumbled and caught herself, but the lurch threw my weight hard to the right and I came down on my bad hip on the lip of the wash. Not a fall exactly, more of a crumple. The horse stood looking at me. I lay there for a minute. The hip wasn't broken again. I'd broken it once and I knew what that felt like, and this wasn't it. But something had pulled or torn in the muscle on the outside of it, and when I tried to get up, I couldn't straighten the leg to get back on the horse. I got back on the horse anyway. It took me a while and it wasn't pretty, and the horse was patient in the way a good horse is patient, not moving while I figured it out. I rode back slow. 4 miles takes a long time at a walk when every step of the horse moves through your hip like a hand gripping and twisting. She was in the yard when I came in. She looked at my face before she looked at anything else. "What happened?" "Hip," I said. "Nothing broken. I came down wrong crossing the north wash." She didn't say anything else. She came to the horse's side and held the stirrup while I came down, which I did slowly and without pride, and she put her shoulder under my arm without being asked, and we crossed the yard to the house. I didn't say thank you, and she didn't say you should have taken someone with you, and I was grateful for both. She got me into the kitchen chair and went for the liniment and the cloth strips she kept in the cupboard, and she worked on the hip for the better part of an hour, not rough, not tentative, just methodical, feeling for where the pull was and working around it. I kept my jaw set. She didn't comment on that either. When she was done wrapping it, she sat back and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at me. "The cold's going to make it worse," she said. "I know. You're going to need to say something when it gets bad. I can't help if you don't say." I looked at her. "I'm not accustomed to saying." "I know you're not." She folded the excess cloth strip neatly, not looking at me. "I'm not asking you to complain. I'm asking you to tell me what's true." I was quiet, the lamp between us. Outside, the afternoon was going gray and cold, the mountain air coming in under the door. "It gets bad in the cold," I said. "October through March most years. Some days it's manageable. Some days I can't work the way I need to." She nodded, not with sympathy exactly, with recognition. "All right," she said, "I'll know then." She got up and put the liniment back. I watched her. She moved in that direct way she had, nothing wasted, her back to me for a moment at the cupboard. "Cecilia," I said. She turned. I didn't know what I'd meant to say exactly. I think I'd meant to say something about being grateful, or about the fact that she'd done all this without ceremony, without making me feel small, which nobody since my mother had managed. But what came out instead was something simpler, because I wasn't a man with much distance between what I felt and what I said, and what I felt was that she'd stayed. "You came here not knowing what you were walking into," I said, "and you haven't pulled back from any of it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I read your letter 3 times, Elias, not twice like I said, 3 times. I knew what I was walking into." I didn't say anything. "You wrote it plain," she said. "Most men don't write plain. They write what they think a woman wants to hear, or they don't write at all what she needs to know. You told me who you were. That's what the agency asks for." "The agency asks for it," she said. "Not everyone does it." She crossed back to the table and sat down across from me again. The lamp was still between us. "You sent for a wife," she said. "I understood that. I understood I was not coming to a young man with an easy life and a whole body. I'm not a young woman with no history either. We were both clear about that, and I think it was the right way to go about it." She paused. "But I want you to know," and here she stopped, and I saw something in her face that was different from her usual directness, something that cost her a little more. "I want you to know that I'm not here because the alternatives were worse. I'm here because when I read that letter I thought, this is a man I can trust, and that is not a thing I've said about many men." I held her eyes. "In Missouri," she said more quietly, "after Thomas died and I was deciding what to do next, my sister-in-law told me I ought to go to my brother in Kansas City and find a situation there. Some kind of work. She was not unkind about it. She just couldn't imagine why I would come out here to this kind of country, to a man I'd never met." She looked at her hands, then back at me. I couldn't explain it to her in a way she'd accept, but I knew what I wanted, which was a man who was honest and sound, and who needed what I had to give and who'd treat me square. The rest of it, the scar, the hip, the hard country, those are just the conditions. You don't choose conditions, you choose the man. I didn't move. I didn't know if I was supposed to say something, or whether saying something would break what she'd opened up. She said, quieter still, "You are a good man, Elias. I know that now for certain, and I don't say that to be polite." I got up from the table. I did it slow because the hip was bad and I didn't have much choice, but I stood up and I crossed the 3 feet between us, and I put my hands on her shoulders, just that, both hands steady on her shoulders, and she turned her face up to look at me. I said, "I have not told you yet what it meant to me that you came." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "I've been waiting to know if it was real before I said it. I know now." She reached up and put her hand over mine. One hand, warm, pressing down on mine. She kept looking at me. "It's real," she said. I didn't need anything else after that. I stood there with my hands on her shoulders and her hand on mine, and I thought about the letter in the tin box under the floorboard, and the 10 months I'd told myself I'd given up hoping, and I thought about the look she'd given me when she stepped down from that stage, the one that was a survey and not a judgment, and I thought about how a man can spend 50 years in this world making himself into something solid and useful and honest, and still sit down to supper alone for 8 years in a row thinking maybe that was just what his life was. I thought about how I'd read her letter 4 times looking for something I'd missed, and the thing I'd missed was this. She was exactly who she said she was. I just hadn't believed someone that straightforward could be real. We slept in the same room after that. She moved her things from the east room and I moved mine back, and we didn't make an occasion of it. It was just the next true thing. The cold came in October, heavy, earlier than usual. My hip was bad for 3 weeks running. I told her when it was bad. Not complaint, just what was true the way she'd asked. She made adjustments without announcement, covering the things I couldn't cover, and then uncovering them again when the cold eased and I came back to full capacity. She never kept account of it. She just moved as conditions required. She had a sharpness to her that I came to love without quite deciding to. She had opinions about things and she delivered them level and plain, and when I disagreed, she engaged the disagreement without drama, and occasionally she was right, and occasionally I was, and either way we came out the other side of it understanding the thing better than we had going in. I had not had that kind of conversation with anyone in years, maybe longer. Prout came back in November, as she'd said he would. He'd hired a surveyor who'd produced a map that conveniently moved the boundary line 12 feet in his favor on the southwest corner. I'm not going to tell the whole of that story because it's not the story I'm telling, but I'll say that Cecilia sat with me at the kitchen table the night before I went to the county office, and she laid out the argument clear and in order, what the original deed language said, and what Prout's surveyor had altered and how to make the county clerk see it. She didn't come with me to the county office. That was my ground to hold. But she'd armed me and she knew it and I knew it, and that was enough. I held the line. Prout went home with nothing and we didn't have further trouble from him. The first snow came on the 3rd of December. Real snow, not a dusting, 6 inches overnight, the mountains white to the tree line by morning. I stood at the kitchen window before first light with my coffee and I watched it. The land looked different under snow. It always did. Bigger somehow and quieter and more certain of itself. I heard her come down the stairs. She came to stand beside me at the window. We stood like that for a while. She had her coffee too. Neither of us said anything. Outside the snow was blue in the pre-light, the fence lines dark against it, the horses standing in the shelter with their heads down and their breath making clouds. After a while she put her hand on my arm, just her hand resting on my arm. She was looking at the window. "It's beautiful," she said. Not to me exactly, just said. "It is," I said. I set my coffee down and put my arm around her shoulders and she leaned against me, not much, just her weight shifting a few degrees in my direction. And we stood there while the light came up over the mountains and the snow went from blue to pale gold, and the day started the way days start out here. Quiet, cold, with a lot of work ahead of it, and the two of us together in it. That's the image I keep. Not the wedding or the conversation at the kitchen table or anything dramatic. Just the window and the snow and her hand on my arm, and me finally understanding what it felt like to have someone who'd chosen to be there. I was 51 years old, and I'd spent most of those years being useful to other people in ways that nobody owed me anything for. I'd been a fair lawman and a decent rancher and a man who kept his word. I'd done all of that without much expectation that it would add up to this. It did, though. It just took her to see it.